like prescribing a particular view of feminism and telling women what they should do. But what they weren't able to realise is the nuance in what we gave you at the beginning of the case, is that we recognise that women hold different views, that people fall like across a different spectrum on feminism, that some people might think some things are sexist where other women don't. We just think, ladies and gentlemen, that people should act in a way that is morally consistent with their views when it comes to their religion, as they do in all other aspects of society. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to ask two questions of today's debate. I want to ask, firstly, on a practical level, how do we best encourage change in the church? And secondly, look at what obligations feminist Christians have and whether or not they should prioritise their religion over their view on gender equality. So let's look at this first issue about how we best encourage change from the church. And I'm going to look at this on two levels, a local level and then like a broader international level of the church as an institution in the Vatican. But what we effectively have on both these levels is a contrast between the two teams. On one hand, we had a team that wanted to support a naive notion of the internal debate that occurs within these communities, which we think is a model that has failed for many hundreds of years, versus one that wanted to encourage change by people leaving this church and encourage change from the outside. So let's look at this. Let's look at on the local level first. So we would say that the first thing we heard from the negative team is that we can have this kind of internal debate in the church and you can have an influence in the community. We think this is wrong for a couple of reasons. The first is just that we think there's a very naive view of how debate actually works within these communities, given they do have given that the debate is a lot about doctrine that can't change, ladies and gentlemen, and given that it takes place within sexist institutions, we think that you don't get that kind of internal change. But secondly, we make the important point that the kind of people that we think should lead are the kind of people that have probably been trying to encourage this change in their church for a long time and haven't been successful. So we think in those instances it's just empirically false that we can encourage change by allowing for internal debate. What we told you though, ladies and gentlemen, is at this local level, people leaving is an important motivation for the church to reconsider its interpretation of doctrine and reconsider the message that it preaches. This is mainly because, at a local level, you're talking a small-scale thing. So if you see, a significant proportion of your regular churchgoers leaving, we think that gives a direct incentive to those people in the church to reconsider. And we told you one big reason why that is that the role of these churches is to spread their word. Now we heard from first that not all churches are evangelical. We would say the kind of problematic ones, the ones that are evangelical, are likely to be the ones that are the most sexist and the ones that are most relevant to this debate. But also we just think, secondly, that there's just an incentive for someone preaching to preach to a large number of people, for someone to feel like they are spreading their word and they are sending a message to a lot of people. And we think it's a pretty clear incentive when the church is mostly empty to change how you're doing things. But also at this local level, we think that the next issue kind of comes into what actually happens between, what kind of relationship do we think exists between church communities, because we think it was asserted that there is no kind of relationship between, there's no kind of interaction between these different church communities, which we think is mainly false. And this is a problem that underpinned a lot of this team's case, is they were assuming people were leaving the religion. People weren't leaving the religion at all. They were leaving their particular local church and going to another, which is likely to have a very similar set of ideals, but maybe just conduct its services in a different way. So we think that kind of change, that kind of interaction is encouraged. But to the extent that there isn't interaction between these different churches, we think that's a problem that exists under both models. And but what actually happens? Anyway, so I'll move now to the idea of what happens at a broad level at the Catholic Church and encouraging change. The one example we heard from this negative team about where we can encourage change by internal debate was on the policy towards AIDS. Ladies and gentlemen, we think for the Catholic Church to finally realise that condoms aren't as bad as AIDS isn't really that significant a development. But to the extent that that is a good thing, obviously a good outcome, we think a lot of that came from people leaving the church out of disgust. And also the idea that they could claim that kind of benefit from their model is wrong again, because their mechanism, but they were saying the first speaker talked about like debate happening at all levels of the church, and these people are will still be Christian and are likely to be attending another church, so they will still form part of that debate. The only difference is that we empower, more likely, as the second speaker acknowledged, we empower the more liberal and progressive churches, so they have a greater sway in that debate. And so what we think that leads to is a situation where we're more likely to receive change in to the extent for like movements towards gender equality. So both at the local and at like the more like international level, we best encourage change through encouraging feminists to lead. But secondly, like what are the obligations of feminists in this instance? Should feminists prioritise their ideology or their religion? We told you a couple of important reasons at first why feminists should prioritise their ideology towards gender equality and sex equality over religion. We told you that like sex is biologically defined, and whereas like you can easily move between different local churches. And we told you, secondly and importantly, there was just a difference in terms of the reasonableness of these kind of things. We think what we have in gender equality is like a rational and reasonable ideology. What we have in institutionalised discrimination in religion is like doctrines that were written thousands of years ago that shouldn't have held much sway in the 21st century. So we don't think it was okay for this team to just say, well, we don't think one's more legitimate than the other as an ideology to live by, because we think fundamentally we promote like reasonableness and logic in the way in which we live their lives. We were happy to say that for that reason gender equality should be prioritised over the religion. But then they sort of, and again, this is something I alluded to in my introduction. They were telling us like that we were prescribing one view feminists act by, that they should leave their church. What we were really saying is that feminists obviously have different, exist across the spectrum, have different views, and we're saying they should act in accordance with those views. We think like institutionalised discrimination in the church and gender equality are necessarily mutually exclusive, and we think people should act in a morally consistent way. We think it wasn't enough for them to just say, well, they can take bits and pieces of different things, and that's more leads to a more nuanced understanding of religion and its interaction with gender equality. Because we think on all levels, the way I act is consistent with what the principles that I live by, and we think if those principles are fundamental to a biologically defined sex, we should act according to those principles. The final thing they told us on this issue was that women shouldn't be used for the broader benefit of social change. I mean, the topic is that we should feminists should leave the church if they think it's sexist, or something along those lines. We think obviously different there are broader stakeholders in terms of the feminist movement and in terms of encouraging change in church. So if we can show you that under our system we encourage those changes, then we absolutely think we should use we absolutely think they should leave the church for the benefit for the broader benefit. And we think there's a significant number of reasons that we gave you at first and second to suggest that women would be better off if they moved to a church that was more morally consistent with their feminist ideology. So, ladies and gentlemen, because practically, our proposal best encourages the church, and because it's consistent with the idea that feminists should prioritise their ideology over their religion, we're very happy to propose this motion.